come on, is aging a disease?
Well, it can be whatever the world wants to call it. And it does seem strange at first when you hear aging as a disease. But when you look up the definition of what a disease is, it's a condition that reduces function, eventually many diseases causing death. And that's exactly what aging does. It turns out the difference between disease and aging is simply that a disease happens to less than half the population and aging happens to more than half of the population. And that's an arbitrary cutoff. And I argue in my book that because we don't regard aging as a disease, we've neglected it, at least for the last 200 years. And that's led to a lot of problems in our healthcare system and in our lives, where we're spending more and more time in a state where not all of our body is kept young for longer, our brains in particular. And I think with this new approach, if we were to define aging, at least as a medical condition, it would change the way we research and develop drugs for most age-related diseases.
So, many of us hear about or know people who practice geriatric medicine, for an example. Are you saying that I should have a code in my office for aging as a disease and get paid for preventing aging or modifying aging?
Yes, I'm absolutely saying that, Steve. And actually, the World Health Organization agrees with me. They have a disease code book, ICD-11, the International Disease Code, and MG2A is now old age. You can now, according to them, report back to them that how many of your citizens have old age. And it's becoming more and more common amongst my doctor colleagues, particularly in Britain, to write on the death certificate old age. And a lot of doctors say, well, that doesn't prove the actual cause of death. And true, we die from organ failure and other things. But what I also want to argue here is that we've been focused for the last 200 years on why people, metaphorically fall off a cliff. But it's just as important, if not more important, to understand what drove them to the cliff in the first place.
Yeah, I think that's a great point. I make the point in the longevity paradox, and you do too, that in years past, the time that we spent in our lives in senescence, in literally going downhill, going off that cliff, was remarkably short. And now, particularly in America and Western society, we spend an extended period of time in senescence, in really getting old. So what's happening in your opinion?
Well, it's what I call whack-a-mole medicine, that most doctors, not all, but most doctors treat diseases. And if you take diabetes as an example, most people will have increased blood sugar levels the older they get. And that's actually a very good sign of aging and how long they will live. But if you were to go to a typical doctor in most Western countries, they would say, well, you need to pass a certain threshold to be a diabetic, and only when you have a disease, I will treat you. Go home and don't eat so many potato chips and get off the couch, but I'm not going to help you with the medicine until you actually have a disease. Whereas we know that a drug like metformin, which is, as far as drugs go, relatively safe, will delay type 2 diabetes if you prescribe it earlier. It's a very cheap drug, as drugs go. And so I'm encouraging doctors to think about prescribing metformin before diabetes actually occurs. And it's a lot easier to prevent a disease than to try to reverse it.